Imagine losing everything you've ever worked for, your home, your dreams, and the future you promised your little girl. That's what happened to Daniel, a loving father who found himself and his daughter thrown out on the streets by a ruthless businessman. But what if I told you that same man who once had nothing made a vow so powerful it would change their lives forever? And in a twist no one saw coming, he not only kept his promise, he took back everything he lost and more. How did a broken man turn a crushing defeat into a stunning comeback? This is a story of loss, love, and the most unbelievable revenge you'll ever hear. Stay till the end, because this is one story you won't want to miss. Once in a small but bustling town, there lived a man named Daniel, a hard-working and devoted father to his little girl, Emily. Life hadn't always been easy for them, but their modest home was filled with laughter, love, and a bond that made every hardship seem lighter. They didn't have much, but they had each other. Daniel would spend hours playing with Emily in their small backyard, imagining all the dreams they'd build together. To Emily, that house was her entire world, a place where her father's love wrapped around her like a warm blanket on a chilly night. But everything changed one fateful afternoon. Daniel had just returned from a long day of work, tired but content, when a sharp knock at the door broke the tranquility of their evening. Standing on the doorstep was a man in a sleek suit, holding a stack of legal papers. His expression was cold, almost mechanical. Daniel's heart sank as he realized who this man was, a representative of the very developer who had been eyeing their home for months. The same developer who was known for squeezing out struggling families like his, turning beloved neighborhoods into luxury developments that catered only to the wealthy. The man handed Daniel the papers, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're behind on your mortgage payments, Mr. Parker. You either pay up in full by the end of this week or the house goes on auction." Daniel felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. He'd been trying to catch up on payments, working double shifts, and saving every penny, but it wasn't enough. He pleaded with the man, asking for more time, explaining that he just needed a little longer, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. "No exceptions, Mr. Parker," the man replied curtly, snapping the folder shut. "If you can't pay, this house is no longer yours." It was a crushing blow. Daniel knew that without the house, they'd have nowhere to go. That night, after tucking Emily into bed, he stayed up staring at the walls, every corner of the home echoing with memories of better days. The smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, the sound of Emily's laughter as they built pillow forts in the living room. How had it come to this? He had worked so hard to build a stable life for his daughter, yet here he was, on the brink of losing it all. The next morning, the reality hit harder than ever. He had 1 week to gather a sum he didn't have. Desperate, he sold whatever he could: furniture, tools, even his old watch, a family heirloom passed down from his grandfather. But despite his best efforts, it wasn't enough. Time was running out, and Daniel could feel the walls closing in around him. Still, he kept a brave face for Emily, not wanting her to see the fear eating away at him. "Daddy, why are we selling our things?" she asked innocently one evening as she watched him pack up the last of their belongings. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "We're just making room for something better, sweetheart." But the truth was far more devastating. The day of reckoning arrived far too soon. The same man from before showed up, accompanied by 2 officers. Daniel stood on the front porch, clutching Emily's hand tightly as they were told to vacate the premises immediately. Emily's wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Daddy, what's happening?" Daniel bent down, his heart breaking as he looked into his daughter's innocent face. We have to leave, sweetie, but I promise I'll make everything right again. I'll find us a new home." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she nodded, trusting her father completely. As they walked away from the only home she'd ever known, Daniel felt a weight like no other. He looked back one last time, his chest tightening painfully as he saw the officers locking the door behind them. This wasn't just a house. It was their sanctuary, a place where Emily felt safe, and now they had nothing. They moved into a cramped, dilapidated apartment on the rougher side of town. It was a far cry from the cozy home they'd lost, but it was all Daniel could afford. The neighborhood was noisy, and the walls of the tiny unit were thin. Emily couldn't sleep for the first few nights, curling up beside Daniel on a lumpy mattress, whispering, "When can we go home, Daddy?" Each time Daniel would stroke her hair gently and say, "Soon, sweetheart, very soon." But deep down, he had no idea how or when that day would come. He started working even harder, taking on exhausting jobs that paid little, just to scrape by. He would leave before dawn and come home long after Emily had fallen asleep, sacrificing his own well-being to keep a roof, any roof, over their heads. But through all the struggle and heartbreak, there was one thing that kept him going: the promise he had made. He remembered standing on that porch, holding Emily's tiny hand, and vowing that he would one day give her a home so beautiful and grand that she'd forget the pain of losing their old one. It was that promise that fueled him, that pushed him to keep fighting, even when it seemed impossible. One rainy evening, after a particularly grueling day, Daniel sat in the corner of their little apartment, flipping through the classifieds. He was exhausted, his body aching from endless hours of labor. But something caught his eye: a tiny ad about investing in low-income properties. Most people wouldn't have given it a second glance. But Daniel was different. He had nothing left to lose, and he knew he had to do something, anything, to change their situation. With trembling hands, he dialed the number listed, speaking to a small-time broker who specialized in fixer-uppers. The idea was crazy. He barely had enough money to cover their rent, let alone invest in real estate. But the broker's words ignited a tiny spark of hope within him. "Look," the broker said, "if you're willing to take the risk and put in the hard work, this could be your way out, a way to start rebuilding." Daniel thought about Emily, about the way her eyes lit up whenever she talked about the home they used to have. That night he made a decision. He would take whatever little money he had and invest in one of these rundown properties. He didn't know much about real estate, but he knew how to work hard. If there was even a small chance that he could turn this into something better for Emily, he would take it. The first investment was a disaster. The property was in shambles, and he barely broke even after months of backbreaking repairs. But Daniel wasn't deterred. Instead of giving up, he reinvested every penny he made, learning from his mistakes, pushing himself harder. He spent countless nights studying the market, taking notes, planning his next move, all while juggling 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Emily noticed the change in her father. Even though he was more tired than ever, there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. She didn't understand what he was doing, but she believed in him. Every time he came home late, she'd wait up, a tiny smile on her face. "Did you find us a new home today, Daddy?" Daniel would smile, brushing her cheek gently. "Not yet, sweetheart, but I will. I promise." And so the seed of his empire was planted, not in wealth or resources, but in a promise made to a little girl who believed in her father, even when the world didn't. The journey ahead would be long and grueling, filled with setbacks and heartbreak. But Daniel was a man driven not by money or power, but by love. And love, as he would soon prove, could build empires out of ashes. Daniel's days blurred into a relentless cycle of struggle and sacrifice. Every morning, he would wake up before dawn, quietly slipping out of their tiny apartment so as not to disturb Emily's sleep. He would kiss her forehead softly, whispering promises only he could hear. And then, with a heavy heart and weary body, he'd dive into another grueling day of work. His schedule was packed: construction jobs during the day, janitorial shifts in the evenings, and on weekends, he delivered groceries just to make a few extra bucks. All the while, Emily stayed behind, spending her days in a crowded daycare, a world away from the little house they once called home. Yet despite the constant exhaustion, Daniel never let his spirit waver when it came to Emily. He made sure that every evening, no matter how drained he was, he would be there to tuck her in, reading her the same bedtime story that she never seemed to tire of. It was a tale of a brave knight who lost everything, only to rise again and build a kingdom greater than the one he'd lost. Emily's eyes would light up every time he got to the part where the knight promised his daughter a castle of her own. She'd look up at Daniel with a glimmer of hope. "One day we'll have our castle, right, Daddy?" Daniel's throat would tighten, but he'd nod and smile. "Yes, sweetheart, one day we will." But the reality was far less hopeful. Every penny he earned seemed to disappear as soon as it touched his hands. Rent, food, daycare costs. It all added up faster than he could count. There were days when he'd skip meals just to make sure Emily had enough to eat. The toll was visible, his frame grew leaner, and dark circles formed under his eyes. Yet every time he felt himself crumbling, he'd picture Emily's innocent face, her unwavering trust in him, and it would fuel him to push a little harder, to keep fighting for that dream. One evening, as Daniel sat slumped in a corner of their cramped apartment, head in his hands, he felt utterly defeated. The weight of it all, the exhaustion, the debt, the helplessness, crushed him. Emily, ever perceptive, noticed her father's weariness. She tiptoed over, wrapping her tiny arms around him in a hug that felt both fragile and powerful. "Don't be sad, Daddy," she whispered, looking up at him with those big, trusting eyes. "You're my hero, and heroes always win." Daniel's heart twisted painfully. He looked at his daughter, the only bright spot in his dark world, and something inside him shifted. He realized then that he couldn't keep living like this, merely surviving day by day. He needed to find a way out, not just for himself, but for her. It was time to fight for something bigger, to turn that promise into a reality no matter what it took. Driven by this resolve, Daniel started scouring every opportunity he could find. He'd stay up late after his shifts, researching, reading, and learning about finance, investments, and real estate. With no formal education or training, his only resources were borrowed library books and free online articles he could access on the library's computer. He devoured information hungrily, absorbing every bit of knowledge he could. Slowly, a plan began to take shape in his mind. His breakthrough came unexpectedly. One night, he came across a success story about a man who had turned a few $1,000s into a small fortune by flipping rundown properties. The idea was risky, but Daniel was no stranger to risk. After all, he'd already lost everything once before. What did he have to lose now? As he read deeper into the article, a flicker of hope sparked within him. Maybe, just maybe, this could be his chance. But there was one problem. Daniel had no capital. His savings were non-existent, and every dime he earned went straight into their basic needs. How could he even think about investing when he could barely afford rent? He wrestled with these doubts for days, torn between fear and desperation. But every night, Emily's words echoed in his mind. Heroes always win. The pivotal moment came one rainy afternoon. Daniel was out running an errand when he passed by a dilapidated house in the neighborhood. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. A faded for sale sign hung crookedly on the front lawn. It was an eyesore, a property no one would look at twice. But to Daniel, it was a beacon of opportunity. He stopped in front of the house, rain soaking through his thin jacket. This was it. He felt it deep in his bones, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Without thinking twice, he took down the number on the sign and dialed it right there, shivering in the cold. The voice on the other end was gruff, impatient. The house had been sitting unsold for months, the owner eager to get rid of it. When Daniel asked about the price, his heart sank. It was still far more than he had. But then an idea struck him. Swallowing his nerves, he proposed a deal. A down payment so low it was almost laughable, followed by monthly installments. The silence on the other end of the line felt like an eternity. But then the owner spoke, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're serious?" "Yes," Daniel replied firmly. "I'm serious." The next few days were a whirlwind. He scraped together every cent he could, selling off the last of his tools, pawning his wedding ring, and taking on extra shifts. When he finally handed over the down payment, it felt like a dream. He owned a property, a rundown, near-condemned property, but a property nonetheless. It was a small victory, but to Daniel, it was monumental. He stood in front of that crumbling house, clutching the keys, and whispered, "This is it, Emily. This is where it begins." The weeks that followed were grueling. Daniel poured every ounce of energy into fixing up the property himself. He learned how to patch up walls, fix plumbing, and replace broken windows. During the day, he'd work his regular jobs, and at night, he'd toil away at the house, sweat pouring down his face as he tore through the decaying structure. Emily would sometimes sit nearby, playing quietly, watching her father with wide, curious eyes. "Are we going to live here, Daddy?" she asked one night, peering through the dusty, unfinished rooms. Daniel shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. "No, sweetheart. This is just the start. But one day we'll have a home bigger and better than you can imagine. I promise." Slowly, painstakingly, the house began to transform. When it was finally complete, Daniel felt a swell of pride he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just a house, it was proof that he could do it, that he could turn nothing into something. He sold the property for a small profit, not much, but enough to reinvest. It was a humble beginning, but it was a start. With every flip, every investment, Daniel grew bolder, smarter. He made mistakes, took risks, and faced setbacks that nearly broke him. But each time he stumbled, he thought of Emily's hopeful face and the promise he'd made. The promise that one day he'd give her a home so grand, so beautiful, it would wipe away every painful memory of the past. He wasn't just building wealth, he was building a future. And slowly but surely, Daniel Parker, the man who had once lost everything, was on his way to creating an empire. An empire built not on greed or ambition, but on love. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about the money or the success. It was about a father's unwavering promise to his little girl. And that, more than anything else, was what kept him going, through every hardship and every struggle. Daniel's life began to change in ways he hadn't thought possible. With the profit from the first sale, he immediately reinvested, buying a slightly better property. Still rough around the edges, but in better shape than the last one. He repeated the grueling process of fixing it up with his own hands, spending long, sleepless nights hammering, painting, and rebuilding every creaky corner until the place shone with potential. And just like before, he sold it for a profit. This time it was enough to buy not one, but two small properties. Word started spreading around the neighborhood about the man who was turning abandoned houses into livable homes. Some people scoffed at his obsession, whispering behind his back about his crazy work ethic. Others, however, began to notice. Daniel was no longer just a man struggling to survive. He was a man with a purpose. A man who, against all odds, was clawing his way back up. Emily saw it too. By now she was a little older, no longer the small, fragile girl who cried for their old home. She had grown resilient, watching her father work tirelessly to keep his promise. She started spending more time with him at the properties he renovated, helping out in her own little ways, picking up tools, sweeping dusty floors, and bringing him sandwiches she'd carefully made herself. Every time they sold another house, Daniel would look at her and say, "We're one step closer, Emily." But the journey wasn't without its setbacks. One of the properties Daniel bought turned out to have severe structural damage, a hidden flaw that wiped out almost all his savings. He could feel the despair creeping in, the old doubts resurfacing. Was he chasing an impossible dream? Was he setting Emily up for disappointment? There were nights when he'd sit alone in the shell of that crumbling house, staring at the fractured walls, wondering if he was building a future or digging his own grave. But then Emily would come by, her face glowing with pride. "Daddy, you're the best builder in the world. I know you can fix it." Those words, so simple yet so powerful, would pull him out of the darkness. He'd pick himself up, take a deep breath, and keep pushing forward. Because this wasn't just about real estate or money. This was about a father's promise. A promise he refused to break, no matter how hard it got. Slowly, Daniel's perseverance paid off. He began learning the intricacies of the real estate market, understanding which neighborhoods were on the rise, which properties held hidden value. He made connections with local contractors, found reliable suppliers, and started hiring a small team to help with the heavier renovations. It wasn't easy. Every penny still felt like a risk, and one wrong move could topple everything he'd built. But he didn't shy away from the challenge. With every new project, his confidence grew. He was no longer just flipping houses, he was shaping a future. The breakthrough came when he landed a deal that changed everything. It was a rundown, neglected, multi-unit property on the edge of town. Most people wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. It was the kind of building that seemed haunted by failure, with boarded-up windows and walls covered in graffiti. But Daniel saw something different. He saw potential, a chance to turn this ugly, forgotten structure into something beautiful. The owner was desperate to sell, and Daniel managed to negotiate an incredibly low price, using every bit of leverage he had. But there was a catch. He had to renovate it within a strict timeline, or he'd lose the contract and all his investment. It was a daunting task, and Daniel's crew was skeptical. How could they possibly turn this place around in time? But Daniel had a secret weapon, his unbreakable resolve. He threw himself into the project, working around the clock. Days and nights blurred as he moved from one room to the next, fixing leaks, patching walls, rewiring the electrical system, and painting until his arms ached. His small team, inspired by his relentless drive, pushed themselves beyond their limits too. They became more than just workers. They became a family, united by Daniel's vision and determination. And Emily was there, every step of the way. She'd come by after school, bringing snacks and words of encouragement. One evening, as Daniel sat exhausted on the stairs, Emily curled up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Are we going to make it, Daddy?" she asked softly. Daniel looked at the mess around them, the half-finished rooms, the mountain of work still to be done. But then he looked at Emily, at the hope in her eyes, and he knew they'd make it, no matter what. "We're going to make it, sweetheart," he whispered. "And when we do, it's going to be the best building in the whole town." And they did. Against all expectations, they finished the project not just on time, but ahead of schedule. When Daniel finally handed over the keys to the new tenants, he felt a surge of pride unlike anything he'd ever felt before. It wasn't just about the money, though the profit was substantial. It was about the journey, about proving that even when the odds were stacked against you, hard work, faith, and love could create miracles. The success of that project put Daniel on the map. Suddenly, people were talking about the man who turned trash into treasure, the man who saw diamonds in the rough. Investors started reaching out, offering to partner with him on bigger projects. Daniel was cautious. He'd seen too many people get blinded by greed and lose everything. But he knew this was his chance to truly build something lasting. He took on new projects, each one bigger and more challenging than the last. With every success, his reputation grew. Soon, he wasn't just flipping houses. He was developing entire neighborhoods, turning forgotten corners of the town into vibrant communities. Emily watched in awe as her father transformed from a struggling worker to a respected businessman. They moved out of the tiny apartment into a modest but comfortable home, their lives steadily improving. But through it all, Daniel never lost sight of his ultimate goal. The promise he'd made to Emily remained his guiding light. He didn't care about fame or wealth for its own sake. What mattered was giving his daughter the life she deserved, the life he'd vowed to build when they stood on the sidewalk all those years ago, staring at the locked door of the home they'd lost. One day, as they drove through town, Emily pointed to a massive mansion on the hill, the mansion owned by the very developer who had evicted them. "Look, Daddy," she said quietly, "do you think we'll ever have a house like that?" Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel, memories of their eviction flashing through his mind. He turned to her, his gaze steady and filled with resolve. "One day, Emily," he replied softly, "we're going to have something even better." And from that day on, his goal shifted. He wasn't just building a real estate empire. He was building towards that mansion. Every property he bought, every deal he made, was a step closer to reclaiming not just a house, but the dignity, the power, and the pride they had lost. He would do it not for revenge, but to show Emily that promises, no matter how impossible they seem, are meant to be kept. And so Daniel Parker, the man who once had nothing, continued to rise. His journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. He was no longer just a father trying to survive. He was a father on a mission, a man who had tasted defeat but chose to fight back, determined to create a legacy that would stand the test of time. Because for him, every brick, every nail, every beam was more than just a building block. It was a testament to a love so powerful, it could turn rags into riches. Daniel Parker's rise was nothing short of extraordinary. The man who once worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over his daughter's head had now become a name whispered among investors, a force in the real estate world known for turning dilapidated properties into prime assets. He moved with a quiet confidence, a determination that radiated in every boardroom, every negotiation. It was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy. And the whole town was watching as the man who had been crushed under the weight of loss transformed into a towering figure in the industry. But while others marveled at his success, Daniel never lost sight of the promise that had fueled every decision he made. The mansion on the hill, the one that had once belonged to the ruthless developer who evicted them, was more than just a piece of property. To Daniel, it symbolized the moment when he and Emily were stripped of everything, standing powerless in front of a locked door that shut them out. That image haunted him, driving him forward even when the weight of his ambitions threatened to pull him under. The mansion had become his ultimate goal. It was no longer just about buying a grand house. It was about reclaiming a part of his past that had been taken so unfairly. But there was one problem. The current owner, a wealthy tycoon who had built his fortune through a chain of high-end developments, was notorious for never selling his properties. It was almost impossible to get a meeting with him, let alone negotiate a sale. But Daniel was no stranger to the impossible. He began his plan in silence, leveraging every connection, every deal, and every ounce of influence he had built over the years. He started by quietly purchasing properties around the mansion, one by one. He invested in the surrounding areas, revitalizing the neighborhood, turning it into one of the most sought-after locations in town. Real estate agents and investors couldn't figure out his angle. Why would a successful entrepreneur like Daniel Parker be so focused on these old overlooked estates? But Daniel's plan was as methodical as it was brilliant. He was making himself indispensable. By the time he finished, the entire area surrounding the mansion was under his control. It was a strategic web. Every road, every lot, every piece of land that touched the mansion's perimeter was his. If the owner wanted to develop, expand, or even maintain the mansion, he'd have to deal with Daniel. There was no other option. And so Daniel made his move. He sent a formal letter to the mansion's owner, requesting a meeting. Weeks passed without a response. Then one morning, a reply arrived. A terse, one-line email. Not interested. The mansion is not for sale. Daniel's face tightened, but he didn't back down. He knew the power of patience, of biding his time. He waited, continuing to buy and develop the properties around the mansion, raising the value of the entire area. It wasn't long before the owner began to feel the pressure. The upkeep costs of the mansion were skyrocketing, the surrounding developments making his isolated estate look out of place and outdated. The man was trapped, his pride the only thing standing between him and a sale. Finally, after months of this silent war, Daniel received a call. It was the owner himself, sounding both furious and desperate. "You think you can box me in, Parker?" the man snarled. "You're playing a dangerous game." But Daniel's voice remained calm, steady. "I'm not looking to play games. I just want what's mine." The silence on the other end was palpable. For a moment, it seemed like the deal would fall apart. Then the man sighed heavily, his anger giving way to resignation. "Fine, let's talk numbers." The mansion, once a symbol of Daniel's defeat, was finally within reach. But the owner's terms were brutal, a price so exorbitant it would drain nearly all of Daniel's liquid assets. It was a test, a final attempt to break him. But Daniel didn't flinch. He knew what this house meant, not just for him, but for Emily. He agreed to the price without hesitation. The negotiations stretched on for weeks, each meeting filled with tense back and forth, each demand carefully designed to make Daniel back out. But Daniel's resolve was unshakable. Every time the owner tried to rattle him, Daniel would simply lean back, smile slightly, and say, "I'm here to buy it, no matter what it costs." Finally, after months of grueling talks, the deal was done. The papers were signed, and the keys to the mansion, the same keys that had once been dangled in front of him as a reminder of everything he'd lost, were handed over to him. Daniel stood on the front steps of the mansion, the place that had haunted him for years, and for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. But there was one person left to see the house. He hadn't told Emily yet. She was older now, on the cusp of adulthood, and while she knew about his success, she had no idea about the mansion. It was a secret he'd kept, a surprise he'd been saving for this very moment. He wanted her to see it not just as a house, but as the culmination of every struggle, every tear, and every sleepless night they'd endured together. On the day he planned to reveal the mansion, Daniel picked Emily up from school in a sleek black car, something he'd rarely done before. She looked at him curiously as he drove through town, passing familiar streets until they began winding up the hill, the very hill they hadn't visited in over a decade. As the mansion came into view, Emily's eyes widened. "Daddy, what? Why are we here?" Daniel smiled softly, pulling the car to a stop at the massive iron gates. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a delicate blindfold. "Just trust me, sweetheart." She hesitated but nodded, letting him tie the blindfold over her eyes. Then taking her hand, he led her through the grand gates, up the sweeping driveway, and finally to the front door of the mansion. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and slowly removed the blindfold. Emily blinked, her gaze adjusting to the bright sunlight. When she realized where they were, she froze. Her eyes darted around, taking in the sprawling gardens, the intricate stonework, the towering windows of the mansion that seemed to reach for the sky. It was a place that had once loomed like a fortress over their small home, a symbol of everything they couldn't have. "Do you remember this house?" Daniel asked quietly. Emily's eyes shimmered with recognition. This, this is the house from when." Her voice trailed off, and she looked at him in shock. "But Daddy, we can't be here. This isn't—" "It is now," Daniel interrupted gently, holding out a set of keys. "It's ours, Emily." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the keys, then back at the mansion. "But how? Why?" Daniel's throat tightened, emotions he'd buried for years finally rising to the surface. "Because I promised you that one day I'd give you a home so beautiful you'd forget all the pain we went through." Emily turned, flinging her arms around him, sobbing quietly into his chest. And as Daniel held her, standing on the steps of the mansion that had once been the site of their greatest defeat, he knew that every hardship, every struggle, had been worth it. Because this wasn't just a mansion, it was proof that love, resilience, and the unwavering bond between a father and daughter could turn the most crushing defeat into the sweetest victory. Daniel Parker, the man who had once lost everything, was now not just the owner of the grandest house in town, but the architect of an empire built on the unbreakable foundation of a promise kept. Emily clung to her father tightly, as if letting go would somehow make the mansion disappear. For a moment, neither of them moved, standing there on the steps of a house that had once symbolized everything they couldn't have. But now it was theirs. The mansion, the grand estate that had once mocked their poverty, now stood as a testament to a promise that had never been broken. Daniel gently pulled back, looking down at his daughter with eyes brimming with pride and love. "Welcome home, Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She stared up at the massive structure, her gaze moving from the sweeping windows to the perfectly manicured gardens. Slowly, as if afraid to believe it, she took the keys from his hand. They felt heavy, almost unreal in her palm. The same keys that had been a symbol of their exclusion were now the gateway to a life they had dreamed about for so long. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal the grandeur inside. Every inch of the mansion had been meticulously restored, its walls and floors gleaming with a beauty that spoke of a labor of love. But it wasn't the opulence that caught Emily's attention. It was the subtle details, the small, thoughtful touches that made this house feel like it was meant for them. There, in the foyer, was a grand piano, something Emily had always talked about wanting to learn. The kitchen, which stretched out with gleaming countertops, held a small handwritten note from Daniel. "For all the pancakes we'll make on Sunday mornings." Room after room, Emily found traces of her father's love and thoughtfulness. A library filled with books she'd always wanted to read, a small studio with art supplies, a tribute to the drawings she used to make in crayon on their old apartment walls. And finally, tucked away in the corner of the house, a room that made her gasp, a playroom filled with memories. There, displayed proudly, was the very same pillow fort they had built together years ago, the one from their tiny living room in their old house. He'd kept it, preserved it as a reminder of their journey. "How?" Emily turned to her father, eyes wide with disbelief. How did you? I made a promise, remember? Daniel's smile was soft, his eyes misty. That one day, you'd have a home so big and beautiful, you'd forget all the sadness we went through. Emily's heart swelled with an emotion she couldn't quite name, a mix of love, gratitude, and something deeper. She walked over to the pillow fort, running her fingers over the faded fabric. The memories came rushing back. Nights spent laughing together, hiding from imaginary dragons, dreaming about a future that had seemed impossible. And now here they were. Every single dream, every whispered hope had been built, brick by brick, into this home. But as they explored the house together, Daniel's mind kept drifting back to the past. The struggles, the moments when he thought they'd never make it. And now, standing in the very place where their pain had begun, he felt a deep sense of closure. This house wasn't just a mansion, it was proof of their resilience, a symbol of how far they'd come. After they finished touring the house, Daniel led Emily outside to the balcony overlooking the sprawling gardens. The view was breathtaking, the kind that made you feel like you were standing on top of the world. Emily leaned against the railing, her gaze sweeping across the town below. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything, and for a moment they stood in silence, just soaking it all in. "Do you remember," Daniel began quietly, "the day we left our old house?" Emily nodded slowly. "I remember. I remember holding your hand and asking you when we'd get to go back." Daniel looked out at the horizon, his voice filled with a tenderness that made Emily's heart ache. "I promised you that day that one day we'd have something better, that we'd have a home where you'd feel safe and loved, no matter what." "You kept your promise, Daddy," Emily whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You gave me more than I ever dreamed of." Daniel turned to her, his gaze steady. "I didn't just want to build a house, Emily. I wanted to build a future where you'd never have to worry, never have to feel the way we did when we lost everything. And I want you to know, this is just the beginning." Confusion flickered across her face. "What do you mean?" Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded document. He handed it to Emily, watching as she opened it slowly. Her eyes widened as she scanned the page, a legal document listing her as the co-owner of the entire real estate business he had built. Every property, every investment, every asset, they were all under her name as well. "This isn't just my legacy, sweetheart," Daniel said softly. "It's yours. Everything I built for us, so that no matter what happens, you'll always have something to fall back on, a foundation for your own dreams, whatever they might be." Emily was speechless. She looked down at the paper, then back at her father. "But why?" "Because you believed in me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Even when I didn't believe in myself. You were the reason I kept going, the reason I never gave up. And now, I want you to have the freedom to build whatever future you want." Tears streamed down her face as she flung her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "I don't care about the money or the houses, Daddy. I care about you. I care about us." "I know," Daniel murmured, holding her tightly, "but I want you to have it all, because you deserve it, because you were always my strength." They stood like that for a long time, father and daughter, wrapped in a moment that was more precious than any mansion or fortune. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mansion in a soft, golden glow, Daniel felt something shift inside him, a sense of peace, of fulfillment. The mansion, the wealth, the success, it was all secondary. What mattered was the promise he had kept, the vow he'd made to a little girl who had trusted him completely. As the night deepened, Daniel and Emily sat together on the balcony, talking about the future. She shared her dreams, some big, some small, all of them beautiful. And for the first time, Daniel felt like he could breathe freely, knowing that no matter what she chose to do, she would always have a foundation, a safety net built from the love and determination they'd forged together. In the end, the mansion wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything they'd overcome. A reminder that even when the world tries to break you, love and perseverance can build something unbreakable. As the lights of the town flickered below them, Daniel looked at his daughter, his heart swelling with pride. "You know, Emily," he said softly. This house isn't the real gift. She looked at him, puzzled. What do you mean? The real gift, he murmured, is knowing that we did it together, that no matter what happens, we'll always have each other. And as they sat there, wrapped in the warmth of their love and the glow of the life they'd built, Daniel knew that this, more than the mansion, more than the wealth, was the greatest victory of all. Because promises kept, dreams fulfilled, and a love that could withstand any storm. Those were the foundations of the greatest empire he could have ever hoped to build. And that, my friends, is the incredible journey of a father's love and determination. If this story moved you, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs a reminder that no dream is ever too big. And if you want more inspiring stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you for watching, and remember, never give up, because the best stories are always made from the hardest struggles.